Hello and welcome back to They Don't Teach This in Law School. I'm your host, Charlie Mann of law firm Alchemy. And for the first time, we have a repeat guest on the show. He was actually the first guest that I had when relaunching the podcast, and for good reason, because whenever we get together, it just is like this flurry of tangents, of ideas mixing together. There's, and dare I say it, there's an alchemy to the conversation. And so I'm so excited to have of CaseFuel, my buddy, Jan Roos. Jan, great to have you back on the show, man.
Always a pleasure to be back on it, Charlie.
Yeah, I think we're foolish for not somehow doing like an in-person event together at some point, but maybe we can make that happen.
Dude, 100%. It's been a while since I've been over on the East Coast, but I got to make it back there soon. And you know what? Honestly, if we want to take a left turn on this before we get to the first question, even
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of like makerspace stuff recently. So I've see your garage stuff on Instagram. I haven't gotten into the leatherworking particularly, but I've actually been doing a lot of wood and weird like there's stuff available for metal and 3D printing at this space I've been going to, but yeah, been getting hands on.
Dude, obviously, I love anything that is like the maker community. There's a good YouTube channel. I like to make stuff with Bob Clagett, and he's sort of a multimodal maker where he does 3D printing, woodworking, occasionally the leatherworking, some metalworking fabrication stuff. He also does some Arduino programming. And he has a course on that. He has a course on Fusion 360, which is good for 3D printing and modeling. And he also has a course on how to do Arduino programming. And I mean, that stuff's just you learn to think different when you're engaged in the maker space. It's so cool.
Yeah, no, I love it, and like I'll say this too. Just it's super interesting. I find that when I'm working on problems that like physical problems, like how can I get this tenon joint to support the rest of this table I'm building, it kind of carries over to stuff that I'm doing in business too, because it's like I think the feedback loop of having a plan that was drawn on a blank piece of paper and getting it through to the finish line gives you the confidence to attack problems that you might have felt were blocked over or like were frustrating you in some sense. And like I find it just such a positive thing for breaking through any sort of like new challenges for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines as well is when you're involved in a physical making, like a physical craft, there's so much more that is within your control to problem solve if we compare it against, say, marketing, which has a degree of like you're putting the in solution in another human being's hands. Whereas when you're running something through the table saw or you're trying to solve that, okay, I sketched this out on paper, but all of a sudden I have to figure out how to assemble the pieces in the right order, or else I'm not going to be able to get the joints to fit together, etc. That's all within your control. And it's kind of nice to get some wins that are within your control, which is, I think everyone should have that type of hobby.
Yeah, no, I think it's super. Not to imply that either of us are taking L's every single day, but I mean, if you're not taking L's, then you're probably in your comfort zone.
Exactly. All right, man. So you're the first person who's going to get the question for a second time. And I thought before doing this, I was like, do I need to reframe the question? I said, I'm just going to keep using the same one. And I'll say it exactly as I do. What's the one thing they don't teach you in law school, Jan?
Okay, so this time the thing I want to talk about is they don't teach you how to help people make decisions in law school. So
That
as
is
far
so interesting.
yeah, and I think there's kind of I pondered this one for a bit, and there were a couple options of what I wanted to bring for this one, but I think it's a pretty interesting one too because this is just something that I've genuinely been in the headspace of for the last little bit. Without going too much into the context, we've had a couple of situations where we're getting into a completely different level of awareness for marketing stuff that traditionally has been held to just the more traditional like solution state traffic, Google, blah, blah, blah. But this question comes up a lot and people start talking about things like, oh yeah, well, like, they weren't ready to make a decision. And I think that's something that I don't hear from the most successful clients that I work with because they are able to take somebody who has a problem and show them why it's an important decision to make.
Okay, this has really obviously kind of broad ranging application, this idea of how to help people make a decision. I hope people heard like that framework. It's not necessarily how you as a human being personally make decision, but that's certainly, you have to be able to process that. You have to be able to step out of your own experience and sort of observe yourself in a third person orientation to understand your own decision making framework to relate to others. But what you've said is how to help people make decisions. So as you're mulling that over, like, you talked about working with a different type of client who understands this architecture. Let's start there with, what do you see as one of those core differences between those who can help people make decisions and those who seemingly can't?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is being open to it. And I'll actually say, as far as the internal aspect of that, helping yourself make a decision, I actually think that's a really important place to start. Because I'll
Cool.
also say that a lot of the people, and this is just kind of a unique thing that uh, you get to see in working as a marketer, if you're both setting up the initial decision that somebody needs to make to start working with you, and then seeing the results of their ability to make other people make decisions, but having any sort of your fingers in the coaching or revenue seam, you kind of get to see these patterns come up too. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've been looking for this, but I mean, I was told really, really early on in my career, there's something people always say is, well, I've heard from multiple people, how you buy is how you sell. And I've noticed that the people that are able to get people to make decisions quickly, they themselves make decisions quickly.
Yep.
And another kind of weird, and this is actually no joke. This was from yesterday. I do a group call with everyone that's in our program once a week, and it's basically just bring me the weirdest thing that happened on your sales call, and we'll give you this way to get around that next
Nice.
time. But it's kind of interesting because especially some of these people, and you can't go back and see what ended up happening with those people, but a lot of times people don't, and this has been quite a journey, but we're gonna bring it back in a little bit. But a lot of times too, people aren't going to ask people to make a decision or help people make a decision because they themselves are not comfortable with making decisions. So we
Mm.
had a situation where somebody was like, yeah, well, I'm not really, I don't feel comfortable asking for the money at the end of this consultation. And what I said with that is, I was, all right, so let me ask you, this is going to sound like a really, really weird question. Do you think it's fair that somebody would be able to make that decision after spending an hour with you, plus all the stuff that we did for marketing up until they got to this point? And they said,
Mm.
yes. Do you think you can help that person? I said, yes. Well, in that case, you shouldn't feel bad about asking to make the decision. As a matter of fact, let's talk about how we can do to get there. But
Mm.
and this is something that I didn't have awareness of before, but it's like literally, if you don't think it's fair to ask, you're going to figure out a way not to ask.
That's yes. So this is really fascinating, Jan, because you're bringing this in here, and I'll tell you, I don't know if it's going to be out by the time that this episode comes out, but one of the courses that we're launching is a sales and money mindset for law firm team members course that
Interesting.
talks a lot about this issue, and it goes not towards tactical training on it, but this exact mindset of you have to actually make the ask. They've shown up at the consultation. They've gone through the marketing process. They've read the materials. They're not there to not take action. They really, I mean, it's like going to the car lot. How many people are going to the car lot just to waste 2 hours on a Saturday? They're probably there because if things go right, they walk away with a vehicle that suits them well.
Yeah. Well, and also throw this in there too. It's probably a lot more fun driving a new car to speaking to most attorneys. I mean, no offense to anyone listening to this podcast, but you're even more, separated from the unintentional fun spin with an hour consultation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So talk more about that, okay, that fear of making the ask. Why is that so common?
Yeah. So I'll say this too. So this is kind of I'm getting some more weird layers on this, but so I mean the first thing I'll say, and then we kind of went over this, but just to kind of cement this, I do have a term for this. I call this the moral imperative to help people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you have the situation where, and again, those are the two things. If you believe it's okay and you think you can help this person, then, and we do a lot of work with estate planning, right? So it's like I always say this on calls. It's like, look, if this person's family winds up in probate in 10 or 20 or 30 years or whatever, shame on you if you didn't do
Yep.
everything you could possibly do to help that. But kind of going back to that belief thing, here's another thing that's really, really toxic, in my opinion. And this is kind of oriented over your own view on decision making, is going to be the filter with which you find what's acceptable. So,
Yeah.
I'll give you a counter example. Another guy on my call yesterday. This guy is fantastic. He ended up closing 6 deals the first full month he had this program live, and he basically ended up had not really charged for estate planning before. He went out of the gate with 4,900. He's since raised he's since raised the price of his trust package to 5,500. But
Hey.
and to correlate this guy's mindset to the results he's ended up getting, he genuinely believes that if he does not close a client in the first call, that it's a write-off. Not to say he doesn't close people on follow-ups, but he acts with intention. So what ends up happening there is that he's going to ask two or if it's in the gray zone and you're like, I could let this guy off the hook, or I could push him a little bit harder. And again, it's usually going to be couples in this situation because it's estate planning.
Yeah.
He asks one more question than the other guys that end up with follow-ups do. But here's the thing: that mindset informs his behavior, and that's a positive example. The negative example, and I'm not going to say negative as if you're a bad person if that's the case. I'm going to say negative in terms of this is going to put downward pressure on the amount of money that you're making. If you think, and this is the flip side, if you think that a follow-up is reasonable, you're more likely to accept a follow-up. And this is negative in the micro and the macro. So, and just empirically, and again, anyone who's listening to this, think about the situations that have happened in the past. And this isn't too much of a stretch of the imagination, but less than 100% of the people that you're going to schedule for a follow-up are going to close. 100% of the people that you collected the money up front are going to close. So, and again, the number is going to range. I would probably say somewhere between 25 and 75% is going to get lost, just as opposed to that. But if you believe that that's okay, you're going to let that happen. You're accepting that loss. So that's the first cost. In terms of if we're thinking statistics, expected value, I'm just going to say 50%. You're losing half of what you charge every time you have a follow up, and you can probably run the numbers on it, and it would run somewhere there. That's the first order loss. The second order loss is that when you have, let's say, 5 follow-ups in a week, or it's when you have 5 follow-ups in the week, you're mentally accounting for a pipeline that's worth 5 times whatever your retainer is. So that actually leads to less of a sense of urgency when you're going to be walking into your next consultation. So that mindset of it's okay to follow up, these people certainly need this time to make this decision, is doubly toxic on your ability to get money out of a group of people and or I would say more importantly, help a group of people that are coming to you for a legal need.
Dude, that is everything that you've said. I'm thinking about even my own experiences with sales and with working with attorneys. And you talk about what I sometimes think of as the lottery ticket syndrome, which is because you have the appointments scheduled, because you have the people coming in, you're presuming that the money is made. And I see what happens is it lacks effort in actually achieving it. I mean, there is something to be said for the Zig Ziglar of it all, which is, Zig's idea was, I'm showing up at your house with your pots and pans. You happen to have my money and we're here just to make the exchange, right? There's something to that. But what ends up happening is there's this tiny liminal space in between that exchange that, if left unobserved and unaccounted for, will completely collapse a sale. And it is this, there's a degree of effort to it. There's a degree of, you actually have to care enough to make the sale, right? That moral imperative that I've got to get the job done here. And what I've noticed, Jan, with some very high level folks is over time, that muscle starts to atrophy a little, where they go from someone who operates with a high level of moral imperative. And as they get more successful, they start to fall victim to, what can I get away with, right? And they start doing a max min organization of what is the least that I can do for the maximum effort, until they tip past an inflection point where that minimum effort is way too low. And what used to be minimum effort to get, say, a 65% conversion rate when they're doing, say, 25% of the effort that they used to do, all of a sudden they go down to 20% of the effort and the conversion rate collapses to 20% overall. And they've lost this 45% gap in there. And it is so frustrating to see that happen because while I'm sympathetic to the idea of being a business owner and or a salesperson and you're running this race and you're trying to do this max min equation, it's natural as a human being. It ends up costing you a lot in the long run because you stop caring, you stop having that moral imperative, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll say this too, like I think a lot of this stuff, it's interesting. So like people have different accounts of cost. And I'll I'll do. I think like the real cost in a lot of this approach is really the cost of comfort. There's
Hmm.
this anecdote. I don't know if this is true or not, but you know the pitcher Roger Clemens.
I'm aware, yes.
Yeah, apparently he used to put icy hot on his package before before he played a game, and the
What?
quote was
All right.
he didn't want to be comfortable on the mound.
Interesting choice. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've never
sure.
tried it, but I can't imagine it would be too comfortable. But again, that's the thing too, because it's like if you get comfortable in a consultation, that's when these mistakes start to happen, right?
Hmm.
So I think the ideal state of mind is to be aware. It's not a given, but you really kind of have to accept the loss and the win at the same time and still go for it. Like, but here's the thing. It doesn't really cost anything additionally to ask these questions for the most part, except for your own comfort. And that's what
Hmm.
a lot of people have to realize. I don't know of any, office space or, vendor that accepts comfort as a form of currency. But if you want to
We'll keep
actually
searching.
have these things, right? But yeah, like that ends up being the cost. It's like how uncomfortable are you willing to put yourself out for? But and I'll say this too, just as far as like people that I've seen that are really really good at this. Like there's a dude, one of my good buddies. His name's Tom Boris. He's been 20 years closing. One of my favorite parts of his story is like he ended up spiking the first 20 consultations he had. He's
Whoa.
awesome. I did an interview with him on my podcast back then. He's an awesome guy, but he goes in there, he's still closing after 20 years. And like he's going in and his mentality is like, look, I'm the king, but I gotta play every single time. And what he notices, and this is something that I've noticed myself too. I don't want to say like any of these things are not stuff that requires active maintenance, but it's like
Hmm.
he's like, whenever I end up breaking my own system, that's when I start getting results down. And
Hmm.
he's at the point where he can snap back in because he's gone through this cycle so many times. He's like, oh, okay, that guy didn't follow up. What did I mess up? Oh, this guy, was uncomfortable or touchy at the end of it. Like, what did I do earlier? And then he's able to not get knocked off for too long. And also, like, when he gets on heaters, he gets on them faster. So that's basically what
Hmm.
one can expect when you have this commitment. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's like it's not doing more work, right? It's not going to take you longer. It's not going to be more intellectually challenging. It's going to be more, emotionally challenging, I guess would probably be the best way to say it. But that's kind of the hardest stuff. You can't really outsource your discomfort, unfortunately. Well, you can,
Yeah.
but those
Yeah,
people you
to a
got to pay a
degree,
lot for.
sure.
Yeah, yeah,
That's that idea of the emotional discomfort. Obviously, decisions are made based on emotion. There are studies that show, and my buddy Adam Boyd was just talking about this recently. There are studies that show that literally the emotional whatever parts of the brain trigger before a logic processing decision gets made. So everything comes from the root of emotion. And that emotional context that anyone brings into a consultation or even just an appointment setting session, right? Because this applies to the people who do the intake in your law firm as well, the appointment setters and the closers. Everyone's got to deal with this. And if you have a negative mindset about closing deals, like if you don't, getting back to one of your earlier points, Jan, if you don't like to be closed, if you resent others for closing you in deals, inevitably you're going to carry that baggage into your own closing process. And even worse, your team is going to observe that you don't like being closed, and they're going to take that baggage times 10 into the closing process. Now, is this something that What's the corrective measure on this?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, this is kind of the thing. I think it's really, and I've heard this piece of advice, and I think it's actually a good one. Like, if you ever have the situation, like, to go through like a sales process for something that's similar to what you're asking your
Mm,
clients to do, and observe what's going through your mind when you do
mm,
this. So, I'll give you an example of a recent decision that I made. And basically, wait, hold on a second. Okay, sorry, this one's clean. We're good. We're good. Okay. So, uh, I had, for me, and like, this, whatever, it's not super important. Um, I had a situation where basically my fiance was not really stoked about the lighting that we had in our house. And I liked this house. I liked this house primarily because it was a 3-minute drive from my jujitsu studio. Um,
ah.
Austin's a decent sized town. You can live pretty much anywhere else. So my whole plan, and I'm going to be completely honest about this, was I was sort of obstructing the move process and trying to like softly downplay any negatives about the place because I knew that in all likelihood, if we moved, it would come with a huge commute basically for me whenever I wanted to train jujitsu.
Yeah.
So we ended up, she was on Zillow, as fiancés do, and found a spot that was basically really, really close. So it was,
Mm,
we have to be paying more per month. And there was, costs associated with getting out of like the place that we were living at the time.
hmm.
And I basically had to make my mind up about whether we wanted to do this. So I did the math. My criteria for this were: one, how happy is it going to make her? There's obviously benefits to that.
Yep.
Two, what are the hard costs of getting out of this place without the timeline that we planned originally? And three, what are my alternatives as far as the likelihood to find another place? The real
Mm,
crux of this entire decision for me personally was that I had not seen a house that matched the criteria of her liking it and being that close to my jujitsu gym in 14 months that we had been aware of this problem. So
okay.
I weighed that against the costs, and the cost benefit was easy enough where we made the decision. The circumstances that I made this decision, I actually had to go in for random medical procedures. So I got like partially doped up. I was playing Starfield on the couch with like 40% of my brain on. And I did the calculation, and it was basically a 20-minute decision. But to
Huh.
kind of like illustrate, and again, that's my process, right? But basically, the way that, and I have to, in addition to the stuff that we do with clients, I have to, I'm actively running a sales team right now, right? So it's like the way that you have to realize is that I have my checklist, but
Hmm.
everybody has their own checklist. And if you
Yes.
can get the information to there, people perceive the sales process. I think in general, people perceive the decision making process as something that has to take time. But that's not necessarily true. It takes information. Sometimes it
Mm,
takes time to get information, but if somebody has the criteria they need to definitively know that this is the right choice, there should be nothing outside of weird self-sabotage stuff that would able to stop them from moving forward. So that's basically it. It's like I kind of always think about this, and it's like like what's the checklist for this person, right? And for you guys to keep this in mind with any single person that you guys are dealing with, it's like everyone's had lay down sales. Well, I mean, hopefully people have had lay down sales at one time or another, right?
yes.
That's somebody who's got a pretty short checklist. Sometimes the checklist is like, do I like this guy's vibe? Or, like,
So I'll be honest. I made a $10,000 decision in December of last year,
yeah,
in about the span of 7 minutes on that.
nice. Yeah. And it's basically, and again, it's going to be different for like, and the other thing too is like, do you mind me asking what it was, Charlie?
It was a mastermind group.
Yeah. And you did the math, right? And that's pretty much it. But basically, on the flip side, there's people that have a 27-point checklist, right?
Yep.
And it's in the process, and that kind of gets more to the technical stuff. But like what you're doing, ideally in discovery when you're talking to a person, and worst case scenario at the end of the consultation or however your sales presentation is structured, And that's basically how I want people to think about it, right? If you can
Hmm.
get the checklist solved, you can get the super, left brain spreadsheet COO slash accountant type to make decisions at first calls. I've seen it myself. It takes a different level of diligence, and
Yeah.
you have to ask maybe 20 uncomfortable questions when you think you can let them off with five. But if you accept the fact that you want to help people, that's what you have to do.
So those uncomfortable questions, when you are dealing with someone who seems more analytical, who it seems like they've got a longer checklist, uh, how do you what type of questions can you ask? How do you maybe even go into like the meta level or the principal level? How do you find those questions to be able to ask them?
Okay, super good question. No pun intended. Uh, so,
Or
okay,
pun intended, it's
yeah,
fine.
yeah. So yeah, basically at the beginning, I like to have some variety of, and there's kind of two major ways we'll do this, right? So I think I mentioned this last week. So ideally, when you're starting the conversation with somebody, and then you have a minute to kind of catch up any slack you might have missed towards the end, right? So,
Yeah.
and before this ends up happening, you need to set up a situation where you're asking questions, and that is probably the number one mistake that I see with attorneys. Is that
Mm.
you're gonna be? I mean, I don't know if you'll be shocked. You do this, too, but the normal structure for a consultation is like, all right, cool. Like, I heard you guys have a family law issue. Like, tell me about that. What questions do you have for me? So wrong.
Mm.
You need to go in and start asking questions, right? And then there's a little way that you can frame that, et cetera. A million people teach a million different ways, but um, a good open-ended question I like to ask at the beginning, I recommend people asking is, all right, so look, we've got this consultation scheduled. What's got you thinking about blah 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 your practice area, right?
Hmm.
That should surface what at least is the most top of mind for that person.
Yeah.
What becomes really, really important from there, and this is where it can become a little bit more uncomfortable, is you want to, and I call this process a deep dive, right? You want to ask a question that was impossible to ask before that last question. So a question that builds
Ooh.
upon a question.
Mm.
So I kind of have this model. I call it a horizontal versus vertical question asking, right? Are we going deeper, or are we staying at the surface? And the
Hmm.
two archetypes that I have for this, one would be like, okay, if you're going into a doctor's office and you're talking with the nurse or the admin, right? They're going to
Yeah.
do their blood pressure cuff, they're going to weigh you, they're going to do your height. All these things are completely unrelated.
Yep.
The deep dive model is like the therapist, right? So,
Hmm.
hey, tell me how your week was. Whoa, how did that make you feel? Tell me more about what that brings up, such and such. And again, these are generic questions. That's usually going to be in relation to what you answer, but no
Yeah.
question. If you look at a therapist, they're never going to ask the same set of questions to different people. And I'll just use the estate planning example because it's super top of mind, but it's just like,
Yeah.
yeah, like, all right, cool. Like, so you guys got all these assets. Who do you want these to go to? Oh, I want these to go to my daughter, but not my son. And some people would say, all right, cool. What's your daughter's social security number? But
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah.
but surface level question, that's horizontal. A deep question would be, that's interesting. Why don't you want this stuff to go to your son? So in general, when we're thinking about the questions to ask, why will generally open things up, and what will
Mm.
generally, or yes or no questions are generally going to be a little bit more lateral. But as you kind of go through this process, you should be able to organically kind of explore the nooks and crannies of where these people's mindsets are at. And again, I
Yeah.
mentioned this for estate planning, but it is everything, right? Hey, what would happen if you ended up losing the house in this divorce? What's not filing for bankruptcy stopping you from doing right now? What's going to happen after you file this business, like, or start incorporate this business, like, et cetera. Could be anything, right?
Yeah.
But in the process of discovering that, not only are we getting these checklist items dotted off, we're also potentially going to ask questions that they themselves haven't asked. If you ever hear, that's a really good question, I've never thought about that.
Mm.
That is probably going to be, that's a 10 points for Gryffindor. Like, you're the likelihood of that closing that person just went up dramatically, right? Um, But that's good because that shows you not only is that, and again, this is a massive rapport builder too. Like I use the example of the therapist in the research that I was doing when I was like, do this for I think I wrote about this in the book first, but it was like, there's this weird thing. It's called the transference effect. So a
Mm.
lot of people end up falling in love with their therapists because it's such a flattering thing to be engaging basically with a mirror of yourself. Everyone loves
Yeah.
themselves. So not only does this develop tremendous rapport, when you can ask a question that somebody didn't have when they came in there, that is showing, not telling your expertise. It doesn't matter if you have all of the awards and the super lawyers and the diplomas for this, that, and the third. If they know what you can use on their specific problem, the weight of that is 1,000x anything that you can tell them. That's showing, not
Yeah.
telling. So basically, that's kind of the first way to do this. And and this is a skill to be developed, right? Somebody doing this for the first month is going to be completely different than somebody doing this, 5, 10, 20 years down the line.
100%.
But you should have way more rapport to do this. And the other thing too is that people become more open with their questions. They start telling you pieces of information because mentally they're making this calculation. When I give here this attorney information, is this conversation going in a better way? Am I learning more? Am I seeing how this solution could be fixed? Or is this just getting passed off and we're going on to the next thing, right? So that's we're able to get more. And then assuming we still have good rapport going into that, what I like to do is kind of like, you recap all the things that you spoke about. All right, cool. So we talked about this, this, and
Mm-hmm.
this. Based on that, my plan would be blah, 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 blah. So I'm just curious. This is where we're going into the catch-up space, right? So we don't know how many of their boxes we've ticked so far, but this is where we
Yep.
hopefully get to the rest of them. All right, so plan is blah, blah, blah. We're gonna be able to do this, save this, get you this. What do you think of the plan as a whole? So it's
One of my
great.
favorite
And then,
questions. People who aren't watching the video didn't see my little like fist pumping. I learned this from Dave D. Once you get to the point where you've kind of set up this sort of, here's how we're going to work together based on what you've listened to, the question that I always ask is, what do you think?
yeah.
And it just pours out from there.
Yeah, and it's great because like I'll say there's like a couple of different things too. Like usually the verbiage of somebody who's going to close is going to be like, oh man, like I love this plus detail. That this is fantastic. Yep. I really like this thing. That was really surprising. I think it's awesome. I'll still ask this question afterwards. Okay, cool. But I know we kind of went over a lot. What else could I give you some more information on? Right. And then this is kind of our little catch to get any of these other things too. And when you have good rapport, people say, oh, shoot, I forgot to mention, I've got the lake house in Michigan. What can we do about that? And then that's great because now, and then the thing is that if we didn't ask that question, they're going to have an open loop heading into the close. And that's going to they're probably not going to be conscious of it, but it's going to feel something like, this might not be right. But again, we keep asking the question. All right, awesome, we can do this. All right, well, now that we're thinking about the lake, like, does this, what else is there? And just keep asking that question. And I ask people to keep asking that question until people are like, dude, relax. Like, there's nothing else. Like, this is perfect. Which again is, if it's true, then you shouldn't have any issues. If it's not true, then you've got a tie down. I thought you said this was perfect. But anyway, that's kind of how we do this. So I'm thinking about a particular situation that I had. Again, this was I was the person who was ending up closing this. I'm not kidding. The presentation was scheduled for 60 minutes total. I got to this point about minute 45, and we went another 45 minutes going around the merry-go-round because this was such a detail-oriented guy. He needed to know the answer for all these different things. But again, because we got all those things handled, by the time we ended up getting to the decision of moving forward, he moved forward, right? So it's like, that's what you have to do. And it's basically, but again, it's like, if you ask that guy whether he planned on doing that day, he probably wouldn't have said that. And like, that's the thing. It's like, so when it kind of gets down to it, if we've gotten people through all the criteria they need to make their decision, if they do say it's going to be XYZ time, the chances are that that's a smokescreen. That's a separate thing that we can address. But there logically isn't any reasons for somebody not to move forward unless there's like some piece of information that you cannot gather within your session with that person. Usually a third party, but kind of different ball wax there.
It's really interesting that you bring up that like taking an extra 45 minutes, right? So they take about 90 minutes to get through that whole thing instead of the 60 minutes. I
Mhm.
have a coaching client in estate planning who one of the things that he discovered was he was not budgeting time well when engineers would come in to talk estate planning, right? Yeah, you
Yeah,
immediately know where this is
yeah,
going
yeah,
because they were all, and it's funny you say it was 90 minutes, they were all taking 90 minutes and it was messing with his schedule. And one of the things that we've had to figure out is A, can we work the schedule to where you have those 90 minutes if those clients are of high enough value for you? And B, do we need to figure out messaging that maybe we're not ending up with engineers? Because if we can backfill all that space in with clients that will convert faster at equal or higher value, will that be better? Or ultimately, can we make both of those things work by bringing in another attorney who maybe handles the engineer clients and you can go and focus on the faster converting ones? But it's just so fascinating that you say that 90-minute timeline. It's exactly what he was going through. They had so many extra questions. He'd like state like, oh, this is the way that this plan will work. And the engineer would immediately respond with, but what if? And they would toss out
yeah.
another scenario, right? And they're just going through that.
Yeah, and as long as those close, it's totally fine. But it's like that's kind of the situation. I'll also say this too, just kind of going back to the how your own views on these reflect. It's kind of interesting too, because if you had somebody who maybe had an engineering background, then they're actually like probably more likely to understand how that brain works. And I'll say
Yes.
this too: this guy happened to be, yeah, I don't think he was an engineer. He was like a COO type, but I actually come from all of the men in my dad's family are all engineers. Like my grandfather worked for
Really?
Raytheon, and my dad was a process engineer. Yeah, yeah. I'm the mess up. Well, I guess I engineer sales process now, sort of. Whatever.
You're going to work that logic
It's a
train to get
stretch.
back there.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah. But anyways, but yeah. So it's like if you're able to understand and speak those languages, but that's kind of the thing too. And like I also kind of had this concept that came up. So it's like thinking about your close rate as a percentage of types of people that you can close. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like if you wanted to say, and people have their own preference. So ultimately, and this is what I really like about that deep dive preference, like process is like as opposed to something more prescriptive, you kind of let people choose their own adventure when they're doing that, right? But if you're able to adapt to, and again, people make different decision making criteria. There's a lot of different reasons that people could close, right? So you got your checklist people that have 27 or 3 points, people who are like more about feeling. There's people who are need to have more or less evidence, or you need to use stories or examples a little bit more. And when you
Mm-hmm.
learn to, I mean, and everyone's going to start with their own preference, which is what they prefer, right? And depending on how large like the segment of the market that you're operating in reflects you, that's probably going to be your base close rate, which is kind of funny. But as you learn to get skills to speak the language of these other people, I
Mm-hmm.
kind of like to visualize this as like stacking these different things. So if somebody comes to me and say, hey, look, I'll use this example too. Funny enough, my friend Tom I was talking about, um, he has a situation with engineers too, but he's a lot more of a fast decision making person. So
Yeah.
his close rate is probably 80 or 90%, but it's like usually it's I think the 80, if you could get to the situation, and he's made peace with 80, 90%. It's no one's he's getting up more groceries than he does. But basically, if you get to the situation where you can learn that last, and that's how people get to 100%. Again, that's realistically not going to always happen, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's like if you have the situation where you're closing 40%, it's like what type of person do you have trouble with? And then
Mm.
that actually gets really, really interesting too, because now we have something that's prescriptive. Because if we have the situation, like if you're noticing your client having an issue, it's a situation with engineers, you guys are already enacting a plan on that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of the thing. If you have the situation where, and general feedback loop for anything in life or business, if something isn't working out, let's see what the commonalities are and try to come
Yep.
up with a game plan for it.
Yep. And it should be that easy, but obviously that speaks to the idea of it decision making and helping people with decision making processes. That idea of pattern recognition. Can you see the patterns that are
Mm.
evolving right in front of you, or that you've experienced before? So that way you can see ahead of time. Oh, this is this type of person. I should fairly expect, say, this level of questioning. That going back to that original idea of the checklist, right? I should
Mm.
expect a lengthy checklist from this individual.
Yeah, and be ready for it at the end of the day too. Like I think a
Yeah.
lot of it kind of gets into like in like experts because it's if you get to this issue, you're like, man, this guy's getting a lot of questions. Like this did like if you don't expect that it happens, you might get a little bit like emotionally on tilt too. But
Yeah.
I'll make a little bit of a pivot here too because this is kind of the situation too when we were talking about with working with people in your organization
Hmm.
because different people have different styles of operating, and if you expect some person act a certain way and that's not necessarily their preference, like you could wind up getting really frustrated and disappointed and maybe make decisions for the future of that person that don't actually reflect what it is that they're going to be able to bring
Hmm.
to your organization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, just as much as knowing is someone more say what I would refer to as process oriented versus outcome oriented. Do they just want to hear the big picture and then they'll go tackle it for you, or do they want to hear exactly how it's done and they just want to run the process, right? There are different types of people both internally and externally within your organization, and the customers, the employees, you gotta apply this model that we've just been talking about to all of those folks. So Jan, before I ask you the last question, which actually you didn't get asked the last time that you were on the
Oh,
show because this was before I was doing this regularly. Where should we send people if they're interested in learning more about you, about CaseFuel, etc.?
okay, gotcha. I would say if you're interested in listening to me, you can go to the Law Firm Growth podcast that comes out every week.
Good
We've
choice.
got a couple real heaters with Charlie on that too. And then if you're an estate planning attorney or you're looking to add estate planning as a practice, I would go to casefuel.com. We've put a little bit of thought into that over the years. And then the last thing is that if you are just an attorney who's interested in just this whole sales persuasion, that
Mm,
aspect of things, I would check out beyondintakebook.com.
yeah.
So I put that out back in July. It's I think no fluff. Got some pretty good feedback from people who have read it. You actually surprisingly how many people will actually read books after they get them. But yeah, that's basically soup to nuts. This whole, I mean, this a lot of you'll hear some echoes of this conversation in this book, but it also goes all the way towards intake marketing, that kind of stuff as well too. So choose your own adventure. One of
There
those
you
three.
go. All right, I have the question for you. It's a three-parter, but it's easy, and that is, Jan, what are you reading, watching, and listening to these days?
Okay. Um, okay. This is. I'm gonna start with watching because this has been like my new obsession.
All right,
Um, so I found this. Okay, not to make this story too long, but I like following a bunch. I got down this rabbit hole of I was originally joining Facebook groups for like just fly fishing around Central Texas, and I just got started getting shown all these like crazy groups, and like I think it was trying to radicalize me. I stopped at the point where Facebook recommended a Flat Earth Society group.
oh,
Going around,
okay.
but the step before that is like all this crazy off grid stuff. So I mean, kind of going full circle to the beginning of the conversation. I find a lot of this stuff so fast. I'm like, oh man, what
Yeah.
would be cool to have something that's completely at the well. So these guys talked about this show, and it's like a very interesting. It was like a History Discovery Channel show. It's on HBO Max, but it's called Homestead Rescue.
Yes,
Did you
yes.
watch Homestead Rescue?
I've watched Homestead Rescue. Yes.
It's incredible. So it's like, just as far as like people making like incredible stuff with
Yeah.
barely anything, it's like fascinating. And I also find like the stakes are so primal. It's like this person doesn't have shelter. Like they're struggling for water. And like I'm
It's
like,
wild.
and you get like everyone cries on the show. Like it's not like, I mean, I could care less if somebody flipped a house and made 40 grand in profit, but I'm like, wow, like these people they're gonna
Made
be able
something
to
out of
eat.
nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I've been watching. What I've been reading, I'm actually taking a bit of a step back from business books for a little bit. I found that I could read business books faster than I could implement them.
Yeah. Yep.
And as far as like probably the best book that I've read in the last, this is one I've been thinking about for a little bit too.
Mm.
Um, I've been getting into, I wouldn't say getting into, I was first introduced to this when I was a kid at Kung Fu class at like age 8. But
Mm.
I find that Taoism is like this.
That's
I
awesome.
think it's a better flavor of like I don't have anything against anyone that's like into like the Stoic philosophy. I feel like it's kind of attracted some less than stable individuals, but The book of, I'm going to spell this out, ChuangTzu. Book of, I think it's pronounced Changzu. I've never actually spoken that word out loud.
Hmm.
But basically, if you're into, I think that anyone in the business positions, like you have to deal with a lot of chaotic stuff.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a more absurdist take on stoicism, but there's like a lot of really weird, it's just all just like parables and stuff to just kind of like chew
Cool.
on. So Book of Shangzu, and I think the other one, Tao Te Ching, is probably the more famous one, but like Shangzu, I
Hmm.
think is the better one from my opinion.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love a good sort of esoteric, mind bending, challenge your preconceived notions about how you should operate as a human being. That stuff is always enjoyable. And then what are you listening to these days?
Um. Okay. Shoot. What was I listening to? You know what? CCR. I've been listening to a lot of Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Nice. All right. Good. That's an awesome
Yeah.
classic.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Very good. All right. Jan, always a treat to talk with you, and you better believe you're going to be back on the show again sometime later this year. And I said this when we record the first episode. I sort of made this like there are going to be certain people who you hear from regularly. Jan is definitely one of them. Always a treat to have you on here, my friend.
Thanks, Charlie. And I'll see you in the next coffee soda too.
There we go.
Every week.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Speaking of which, I got to go and record that.
Okay.
Thank you
Awesome.
all, and I'll see you in the next episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School.